based on Ruth. So if you have no Ruth, or if you're not tied to Moabites, you're not making a connection to Moabites, you're ruthless, or you're less of Ruth. And when we look at, you have people doing you have people doing things out there that are considered ruthless. When you check them, you realize that they are not tied to the illustrious history of the Moors. Like, we know that they're not tied to the history of the Moors, right? They're clearly not tied to that history. So when we say that we are descendants of the ancient Moabites, always keep in mind that once you put this in it, you're going beyond what the story says in the scriptures and all that about the Moabites. We're going beyond that. Once you put ancient, right? That's why he always put ancient. When Old Jolly referred to the Canaanites, he said ancient. Because if he just said Canaanites, everybody's going to tie it to the curse stuff and all that, which has nothing to do with Asiatic or dark-skinned people. That's modern story. That's that stuff that came about 325 AD with the Council of Nicaea. But we're talking about 10,000 years of history. If we're talking about they only went back 325 AD, then they're missing a few thousand years to even make a claim relative to Moabites, Canaanites, Israelites, or whoever else is mentioned in quote-unquote Holy Bible or Scriptures or whatever, right?
And then the Council of Nicaea also connecting with the fact that that's where modern-day Christianity came
Right.
out of, which was 300 years after Yeshua or Jesus was around. So then you ask yourself, well, why would a council 300 years later, why would that be really where this came out of?
The focal point.
Right? And then you realize that that came out of from Rome. That was the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, right? Which was really just a control system versus the true spirit. Right? And Constantine, once you connect that back to Rome, which has nothing to do with us. And
All these people who call themselves Christian, they're lying to themselves. They're really Constantinian.
And so here's another thing, when you were talking, because I'm from Trinidad, so-called Trinidad and Tobago, and you're from the Caribbean islands too, which were considered, not Dominica, which were considered the West Indies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why was it called the West Indies?
Right.
Because, and you can go into that, right?
Why was it called West Indies?
We're going
We're going there right now.
Okay.
just so we can understand the connection, and this just brings us back to the history part of it, right? History.
So, if there's, we know what we'll do? We'll do the call and response or whatever, right? So, let's use our common sense. If there's a middle,
East,
right? There should be a middle,
West,
middle,
north,
middle.
south.
All right. Are there those things?
no.
All right. So, we X that off because
There's
it's
no-
obviously an illusion.
Yeah.
Everybody's been played because they call that place this today. And nobody ever asked the question, hey, hold on a second, if there's a Middle East,
Where's the Middle West?
where on the map is Middle West, North, and South?
And then more importantly, where's East?
Right. Right? Because really, this is really central. This is not really east. It's east. It's going east, but the actual place is really central. Right? So if there's a West, there should be a
East,
East,
and a
north,
and a,
south.
and if there isn't, clearly they're dealing with, this is an illusion, right? So all these people have been played thinking that that's a reality. So when we do our research now, you find out that the place that's tied to this, they'll say that that's also Nubia. They'll say that that's also Kush. They'll say that that's also Egypt. They'll say that that's also Palestine, Canaan, etc. Right? West Indies, they also say,
Caribbean.
Caribbean, right?
which is really supposed to be
East. Caribbean.
right.
Caribbean.
This is really supposed to be this. Because this jurisdiction was known as the land of Caribs.
Caribs.
So anybody who's from there would be
Caribbean.
Caribbean,
Yes.
right? Just like anybody else from anywhere else is going to be an Ian something,
Right.
right? But now, if we check the map, you realize that all those islands are really America.
And they have a plate, go ahead, sister.
I'd just like to add that in Dominica we have what we call a Carib Reserve. So you've just made
Connection.
a connection for me.
right.
But they
I
call
think
it-
that's the only island we have a Carib Reserve,
reserve
because
for
they
Caribs.
found them hiding
Right.
in a valley.
And they call it a reserve too, and when you break
They
down
call
that
it a
now-
reserve.
Right.
The
But
British
that's
call
all
it.
part,
Right,
right,
exactly.
who's calling it that?
Key
right?
point.
The British.
So, right.
British
So
call it a
that
reserve.
here was another thing that connected with me too for us, and this is where the connection came. So supposedly it was called the West Indies because when Columbus came here, he found people that looked like the people that were in India. So that's why they called it the West Indies. But who were the people that he met here? Copper-colored people. They were us. They weren't the Indians that you see in India, though even the Indians that you see in India, the ones that you see on TV,
Yeah.
those aren't
The
real
Indians.
Indians. Those are the ones that they put on TV. The same way when you see Brazilians, they all look like they're sort of like just
Yeah.
a little bit darker than the European. When really the Brazilian looks like, when you see a lot of Brazilians, they look exactly like us.
Right.
But I need a little clarity in that the Caribs, their hair tended to be straight in my country
Mhm.
and of light skin.
Right.
So that's why I was taught that they were Amerindians from North America
Right.
who had traveled to the island.
To the island, right. Now, if you do your research on, we were talking about this at, I think we were talking about this at the hair show, that there's no one phenotype for our people.
Oh,
It's assumed that that's the case.
And it's assumed
That
by
everybody was looking like his shirt, and they had the nappiest hair ever, and the biggest noses ever, and the biggest lips ever, and those were the only people that were on the planet. That's an illusion, right? Because when we go back to the hieroglyphics, they had people with straight hair on there, and that's ancient stuff. So those things had straight people on there, and they were dark too. They got pictures of sisters on hieroglyphics with hair down to their back or whatever. And clearly it wasn't locks that they had or whatever, their hair was straight. So we know that there's a lot of propaganda in with that.
and also manipulation of historical facts.
Historical facts.
To fit the paradigm, because once you get behind so-called Christianity and so-called Jesus being the beginning of everything, because that's what you start looking at, they have certain periods of time when they basically took over, and that's where they start history from.
Start telling their story.
Starts telling their story from. And once you go back anything before, but beyond that, which really takes sort of scholarly knowledge, you start seeing that they start calling them us by different names.
Right,
Which
so
they-
relative to just what we're talking about with 325 AD and the Nicene Conference.
Constantinopolitan
Right?
Creed.
when they say West Indies, they're implying history started in 1492. With Christopher Columbus discovering the new world and all that stuff, and then that's where they start from. But as soon as you go before that, you realize that all these Europeans were slaves to us. They didn't have no boats and stuff like that. Talk about slavery and travel people all over the place. They were actually on the run from us. Like, they were actually the ones that were the runaway slave. When we go back, when we go prior to 1492, at 1492 is when the fall happened. So we have, Middle East, all these confusing things going on, in order to cloud the history, so that people don't know where they're going, right? Because in order to, there has to be some type of knowledge by the individuals about who they are historically. If they don't have that knowledge, then they're game for anything to be put in here.
And that's what they've done. They've confused everything. So then you're not connected, and then they put the story on, and it's sort of like it sort of imprints on you because you have no other reference point. I was talking to just an empress today, and she was talking about how the Vietnamese and those people, they speak Manchurian, they speak Chinese. I didn't know this. But she was telling me that pretty much China, which is what we realized, those are our sort of brothers, sort of, or the sort of the connective, the next sort of nationality that's connected with sort of the ancient people. That she was telling me that a lot of these places that you think have their own nationalities, really, when you sort of keep going back, they're really connected to China.
Right.
Which when you look at sort of when this goes back into history, when you're talking about some of these people that you say were the Caribs that had long hair, really what that speaks of is the fact that the Chinese, the so-called Chinese and the so-called blacks or the Moors, we were the ones here mating together. So that's
everybody
where you
came here and saw.
That's where you get the sort of common day so-called native Indian that has that long straight hair and has that sort of weird phenotype, which really is the connection between us mating with them.
And then people looking at that as a separation.
So then I just
when
wanted
it's
to
really showing the connection.
the connection.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I just wanted, and the one last thing was she was telling me about the Filipinos. And what she was saying to me is that the Filipinos, because she works with a lot of Filipinos, and she was saying that a lot of them are connected with the Spanish. But what you have to realize is the so-called Spanish aren't the Spanish, it's what they renamed the Moors to disconnect us from what was really going on. The modern day Spanish, or the ancient Spanish, were the Moors, that they had to rename to then sort of disconnect you.
And this is where you go into
The Spanish Armada, was the Moorish Armada. So when you hear about that battle that was happening over here against the Spanish, that was us battling them. That they were trying to imply was really them, the American being the European,
And you
battling the Spanish, who you think is Queen Isabella.
Right.
And so what they did is and that's where when you think about the American Civil War, which you think was really the European who came here, which was the cousin, the Europeans who were bad guys that were fighting against the English, that was really us that they were battling. It was really the American who was us, the copper-colored people, battling the European, which were the British. So what they've done is they've continued to take us out and then
confuse the story.
That's right. So then you're lost. So when you're talking about the Civil War and the Americans, and I'm starting to look at this. Who were the Americans?
Right.
And they keep telling you that it was the Boston Tea Party and all this kind of weird stuff. That wasn't them. They weren't here.
Yeah.
It was the Americans were us. Which, when you go back far enough into the dictionaries, they tell you that American is any copper-colored person living on the land.
Before the Europeans came here.
Before the Europeans came.
So anybody who was copper-colored that was in the Americas before the Europeans came here are the real Americans.
And America is North, South, and Central America, and the adjoining islands, which are
Caribbean.
Right.
So that's just the history to connect you to it, so that now when you start looking at this, you see this from that perspective. But they're trying to call you anything else West Indian.
Right. So our training came from Africa, right? Came from slavery, etc. But if did you grow up in Dominica? Did you spend time there?
London, England.
Okay. Did you spend any time there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
With